I have to say, we are recording this evening, by the way, just to alert you, we are recording. He's a member and former ambassador of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta to the Slovak Republic, and he previously served as United Nations official representative for 32 years. He has published in scholarly journals on public policy, history, genealogy, and interfaith matters, and lectures at the Sorbonne in Paris and in Berlin, Brussels, Dublin, Helsinki, Kyiv, Madrid, Riga, Rome, Segovia, and Vienna. His recent book is about his incredible family, the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell, A Hidden Legacy. It was just recently published in 2018, and he served as director on the boards of several organizations, including as chairman and presently a trustee director of the School of Civic Education, formerly established as the Liberal School of Political Studies of Moscow. He is also a strategic advisor of the Global Partnerships Forum of New York, and is involved similarly with the Nonviolent Peace Force, an umbrella organization, a coalition of NGOs with multi and by funding and active in unarmed civil protection in conflict zones. In early 2012, he was appointed to the Council for the Order of Clans of Ireland, of which he's probably most proud of that, under the patronage of the President of Finland, and was elected as Chancellor in 2014 and served till 2015. Graduated with honors in economics and philosophy from the National University of Ireland at the University of College Dublin, and read international law and diplomacy at postgraduate level in Geneva. And I will end by saying, I know this good man is my friend Frank. He's an old UN colleague, and he was a neighbor where we both served the United Nations in Lesotho. And I remember more than one party at my neighbor's house where the rugs would get rolled up so people could dance. So welcome, Ambassador O'Donnell. And with that, may we please hear from you?
Thank you very much. Good evening, all. Let me begin by paying tribute to my good old friend of long-standing, Betty Dancing. And as she rightly pointed out, we met 40 years ago when we both worked for the United Nations in Lesotho. It seems like yesterday. And thank you also, Indiana Council on World Affairs, for inviting me to speak to your audience. Talking Indian, like Indiana, I know that not too far away from you in Oklahoma live the Choctaw Nation, and I will mention here an Irish debt of gratitude to them for their kind donation in 1847, not long after their suffering the Trail of Tears, towards relief during the Great Irish Famine, an act of compassionate outreach that exemplified one of the better qualities of globalization. As you know too well, that famine also drove so many of our ancestors to your shores, more globalization through migration. In 2017, we hosted a delegation of Choctaw in County Cork in the south of Ireland for the unveiling of the Kindred Spirits Memorial sculpture in an act of reciprocal transcultural appreciation. Betty kindly drew my attention to the excellent article by Anne Kruger on the same topic, The End of Globalization, which appeared in the Great Decisions Journal of the Foreign Policy Association in 2020. I have my copy here. Thank you, Betty. It gives a historical overview with a primarily economic analysis of globalization. Tonight, however, I will hope to avoid too much overlap and rather bring some additional considerations to the debate, focusing less on economics and more on various indices, values, institutions, and the rule of law. So let me begin on that note and say that, of course, this will necessarily involve some historical perspective, additional perspective, but you can deduce from this history the need for quite some specific corrective measures. There are, of course, two senses to our title: the end as the cessation, or the end as the purpose, terminus. No doubt a cessation of globalization will bring a collapse of global civilization, whereas a terminus would be some lofty completion of global integration and the emergence of a truly convergent planetary consciousness, values, and institutions. Neither are the case, nor likely to be soon. So my contribution tonight will touch on globalization from the perspective of multilateralism, which underpins the institutional expression of dialogue, negotiation, compromise, and common prioritization on a global scale. Multilateralism espouses common values as universal and aspires to pluralism through diversity. We may think much of this is in question today, but it has always been. The challenge is to understand the relative strengths, the trends, and the factors that play in determining interim outcomes. For there is no ultimate result. We're in a world of flux and continuous evolution to a point, theoretical if not teleological, let alone theological, Betty. A terminus we know not, although Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Vladimir Vernadsky had some thoughts on that in their notion of the noosphere. Our time horizons are also paramount determinants and benchmarks as we set targets, the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, decarbonization by 2050, and so on. Now, in this regard, we need to explore, I would say, the dynamic between populism, liberalism, and multilateralism, but also the core values of the UN system, the evolving role of intergovernmental processes, and the complementarity with civil society and other vectors of influence, including corporate, as these affect the global commons on land, sea, and in the air and outer space. These factors will determine together our priority challenges for the future and the consequent imperatives for structural and constituency reforms and resources of the UN and indeed the Bretton Woods institutions and other global instruments at global and subsidiary levels. But first, a little historical insight, a word on the legal underpinnings of modern globalization, which I hope will complement the analysis by Anne Kruger in the Great Decisions magazine. Modern international law began to emerge with the concept of national sovereignty that the Peace of Westphalia brought about in 1648 in Europe at the end of the devastating 30 Years' War, which eliminated millions of people. It was perhaps, if it had been on a planetary scale, it would have been the first global world war, and it almost reached that. The 30 Years' War in Europe was between the Catholic and the Protestants, between the North and the South. Its early paradigm of I would say, the Peace of Westphalia, that paradigm was based on the theory of natural law by Hugo Grotius of the Netherlands, who brought out the notion of an international community, and on the theory of sovereignty developed by Jean Baudin in France in the preceding century. Up to that time, the principal source of authority was divine law, and there were no central legal subjects as in modern law, but rather imperial, royal, or papal rule. Sovereignty was vested in the monarch, and there was no notion of state sovereignty, let alone popular or democratic sovereignty, as we might see it today. Instead, religious values were paramount in that era of late Christendom, a concept which we are familiar from the history of the Crusades as well. So this is a very European take on this, and I'm not really addressing the consequences of what it might have been considered globalization in China or the Far East. But Westphalia depersonalized sovereignty, took it away from the monarchs and rendered it societal. The period from 1648 of the Treaty of Westphalia to the Congress of Vienna in 1815 was the first for the effective development of modern international law, as states became the dominant players, not monarchs, or not only monarchs, and European empires expanded across the world, bringing globalization to its first truly systemic manifestation. So it's funny that you think imperialism was perhaps the earliest truly global manifestation of systemic globalization. This required new treaties and laws to regulate the boundaries between sovereign states and indeed between their colonies and their mutual relations, leading also to the law of neutrality in international affairs. And through the 19th century, the legal quality of the state was increasingly regulated internally and internationally, and the locus of sovereignty permanently shifted from emperors, kings, and sovereign princes through the institution of the state exercised by government on behalf of its people or nation. The rising prosperity that ensued as a result of early globalization and the Industrial Revolution, well described by Anne Kruger's article, brought about its own huge systemic dislocations that eventually led us into the heyday of nationalism and the two devastating world wars in the 20th century. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the 20th century before we come quite to the 21st. Because after World War II and the creation of the United Nations, as Europe reconstructed itself, not least with the assistance of America's Marshall Plan, the process of decolonization led to the birth of many new nations. The UN and its agencies were at the forefront of efforts to develop these countries in the third quarter of the 20th century. And if I were to go back to the early days of my career in Africa, when I first met Betty, we were dealing with development in countries that had only recently been colonies and where there was a very slim degree of human development in terms of, I would say, education and the capabilities for governance, which was why organizations like the UNDP were so involved in trying to help create the instruments of good governance in those countries. But these newly independent countries and their progress, and indeed the progress of all, is one of the great multilateral successes of globalization, even if it was not without growing pains and lessons learned. And during that time, many other multi-bilateral players, including NGOs and the private sector, joined the field of development. And the preeminence of the United Nations role, as I would have remembered it in the 70s, in the decades that followed, declined as countries also took increasing charge of their own development towards the end of the 20th century. The evolution of technical, scientific, and investment cooperation played a key role in the emergence of an increasingly global market economy, boosted significantly after the end of the Cold War, and even more so with the information revolution. And in addition, notwithstanding many conflicts, increasingly internal rather than interstate, there has been an overall real decline in the scale of fatalities due to armed conflict and in the levels of social violence worldwide. I'm not taking into account here what might have happened during the pandemic, but most of all, we have had no world war since 1945. Plenty of regional ones, but no world war. The other great achievement is the enormous growth in the body of international law and global norms through multiple treaties, conventions, and frameworks, and their standard-setting institutions, organizations, and agencies. There are also the Bretton Woods institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and more recently, the successor to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which is the World Trade Organization. Many would agree, though, that the UN and most of these other institutions, with the exception perhaps of WTO and maybe even WTO, are in long overdue need of major reform. Now, the emergence of the European Union, taking a little parochial perspective from Vienna, the emergence of the European Union from the early coal and steel community stands apart as the most advanced experiment of a supranational community of states based entirely on consensual convergence, subsidiarity, and increasing integration, as distinct from the spread of empires and the survival, even to this day, of enormous post-imperial domains such as China, India, Russia, and the United States. So this EU, in that sense, is quite exceptional. The Brexit burp notwithstanding. So it is easy today, in this third decade of the 21st century, to forget the era of decolonization and how its ebullient explosion of new states magnified enormously the global reach of the United Nations and the international system, the international community itself. But no sooner had it largely been completed than some of the big powers, declining in influence, desired the empire to strike back. Now, in my memory, and it's a bit of a long one, forgive me, I remember the Regan Thatcher era because, like Betty, I was in Lesotho at the time. The Regan Thatcher era, or the Anglo-American era, if you wish, was the beginning of what I consider to be the radical questioning of the United Nations, and in due course, what became an assault on multilateralism, especially under the recent President Trump. Why was this 1945 entity not fit for purpose? It was also the beginning of the neocon politically and the neoliberal economically thrust that led to vast deregulation. And by the 1990s and the end of the Soviet Union, the rush to privatization, or if you wish, the theft of the global commons, global public goods, and often the empowerment of state capture by economic interests. I will explain as I go on. But first, let me talk about the metrics of globalization. I will return to these issues shortly. The measurement of globalization. One of the early pioneers of the measurement of globalization was the A.T. Kearney corporate effort to develop a globalization index back in 2002. But many others have proliferated since. My own country, Ireland, for quite some years, dominated the list at the top of the globalization index of A.T. Kearney because it was the most extroverted economy and society in the world, still riding on its Celtic tiger. You may know that we have an enormously large diaspora, 70 million people across the world who can claim recent Irish descent. Why is it so big? It's so big because we were a country of 8 million in the 1840s, and we would have been a country as densely populated as Britain or the Netherlands today, were it not for that great famine that I mentioned earlier in the context of the Choctaw Nation's generosity. So Ireland is an extremely globalized country from that point of view. And this is St. Patrick's Week, normally we would say, and the world has gone green on St. Patrick's Day, although our typical way of celebrating it is suspended by the pandemic. Now, beyond A.T. Kearney's Globalization Index, there were many others that followed, such as the G Index, or Governance Index, Globalization Index, excuse me, and the CSGR, the CSGR being the Center for the Study of Globalization and Regionalization in the University of Warwick in Britain, the CSGR Globalization Index, the Maastricht Globalization Index, and the later KOF Swiss Index of Globalization. There are many of these. They contained differences in numbers of countries and years covered and in the nature and weighting of the indicators. But one of the recurring observations in these indices was that the countries that consistently ranked at the top were for the most part European countries. Regional dimensions of integration were also explored in many subsequent studies. And one of the most recent studies worth noting is a comparative analysis of previous indices in the paper, A New Index of Globalization, Measuring Impacts of Integration on Economic Growth and Income Inequality, which was published by the Asian Development Bank in its Economics Working Paper series in July, almost 2 years ago. It was by two Koreans, Hyun Seung Kyu and Sin Young Park, and I'm probably not pronouncing those names correctly, but there you are. It was an ADB paper, number 587 in its series on economics. Now I would like to focus on other measures for reasons that will be apparent. The Human Development Index, which was introduced in 1990, was in part a response to the domination of GDP, gross domestic product, over economic and political policy. And it was a response brought about by Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul-Haq under the leadership, of all things, of a venture capitalist from California who could see beyond profit, William Draper III, the UNDP administrator at the time. Now, let us take a look briefly at the impact of globalization on human development. The first Human Development Report coincided with the fall of the Berlin Wall, more or less, from a historic point of view. and the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Cold War. Already 20 years prior to that, by 1970, the post-war successes of the Soviet command economy had also brought dramatic improvements to the lives of its citizens. Soviet expertise in industrialization and science was a major contributor to third world development. The USSR was by then second only to the USA, even though Soviet productivity was far below America's. But as the pace of change accelerated, Soviet utter dependence on top-down decision-making could not keep up, and huge inefficiencies emerged. The more the USSR economy sought integration into the emerging global economy. Centralization and campaignology became obstacles in unbalanced growth, as doctrinaire decisions were taken in ignorance of market dynamics, despite advice from Soviet economists such as Petrokov. By the same 1970s, Japan was also emerging as an alternative model of development, neither Soviet nor strictly Western. In fact, 20 years later, by 1990, Japan ranked on top of the list for human development in the world's first Human Development Report. In comparison, the USSR ranked far below in 26th place, the USA in 19th, Ireland in 17th, Finland at 11th, the UK at 10th, and Norway in 6th place, whereas China in 65th place. Now, the Human Development Index reflected the new post-Soviet states for the first time in the 1993 report, where we see Japan still in first place. And some other changes: a reunited Germany in 12th place, Norway up to 3rd place, and Finland and Ireland down to 14th and 21st respectively, where the USA had climbed to 6th place and Russia had fallen to 37th. China at this time had dramatically fallen further from 65th to 101st place in human development. Fast forward to 2006, Norway, instead of Japan, had risen to 1st place, and Japan had fallen to 7th. Ireland had risen to 4th place, and the UK fell to 18th, a dramatic historic reversal in comparative standing between Britain and Ireland. A revised method for calculating the Human Development Index was introduced in the 2010 report using GNI, gross national income per capita, at PPP rates or purchasing power parity rather than GDP. By 2016, Norway remained on top, and Japan had fallen further to 17th place. Remember, in 1990, it was in 1st place. Ireland was badly affected by the 2008 recession and German bondholders and had fallen, but then recovered to 8th place, replaced by Germany in 4th. The UK climbed marginally up to 16th place, and America had fallen to 10th place, but Russia recovered, joining the very high, albeit at 49th place. China was at 90th. Not to dwell too much on these statistics, but coming to the most recent Human Development Report for 2020, the principal theme is the next frontier, human development and the Anthropocene. Norway still remains on top for the 16th time, and Ireland has climbed back to 2nd place, shared with Switzerland. Germany fell to 6th, the UK rose to 13th, and the USA fell further to 17th place. Japan is in 19th place, shared with Israel, and Russia has fallen to 52nd place. Mainland China rose slightly to 85th place, but Hong Kong ranked extremely well separately at 4th place. Hong Kong was treated as a distinct economic territory for these purposes. So since the beginning of the Human Development Report and the index back in 1990, and adjusted for methodological changes on a couple of occasions, the total global human development performance has risen from 0.601 in 1990 to 0.737 for 2020. 30 years net improvement in human development on a global scale. I should add that the data refers to the year prior, therefore we're dealing with data of 1989 to 2019, the HDR being published in the following year. Rank-wise, in the human development story, The best top performer has been, you almost guessed it, Ireland, which climbed from 17th initially 30 years ago down to 21st to second place in 2020, the greatest single improvement. Japan fell from first place to 19th. The USA nudged up only 2 places over 30 years from 19th to 17th, and the UK actually fell from 10th to 13th place over the same 30 years. The USSR broke up, but Russia fell from 37th in 1993 to 52nd 28 years later. And despite its economic rise, China has fallen from 65th place to 85th over these past 30 years. This is a paradox, as China's Human Development Index was 0.499 in 1990 and rose consistently to 0.761 by 2020. But these are comparative rankings, and this just means that other countries did better in their progression. Demographically, however, there can be no doubt that China's advance has lifted the greatest cohort of humanity to a substantially improved level of human development. And all of these are the consequences of globalization. Now, a little word on globalization interruptus, if we can call it that, and regional disintegration. Already by 1988, the USSR's twilight had come. Gorbachev's glasnost opened debate, and perestroika called for reform of the system, essentially through self-government and adoption of what the EU would later call subsidiarity. In fact, to an extent, the EU today models some of the reforms that Gorbachev sought for the Soviet Union in terms of democratic practice. But sadly, Putin's Russia today does not, neither in terms of its re-centralization, reversal of democratic reforms, nor its restriction of civic and media freedoms. What about freedom and democracy? According to the Personal, Civic and Economic Human Freedom Index, produced by the Cato Institute in Washington and the Fraser Institute in Canada, New Zealand is in first place in terms of human freedom, as distinct from human development. New Zealand is in first place, Switzerland is in second, and ironically, prior to the crackdown by China, Hong Kong was in third place, followed by Denmark, Australia, Canada, Ireland in seventh place, and Estonia. Germany tied in ninth place with Sweden, and a trio tied in 11th, Finland, Japan, and Luxembourg. Austria tied with Norway in 15th place. The UK and USA are still tied at 17th place in human freedom. Italy is way down at 31st, and a flagging France at 33rd. Israel is far below at 53rd, on par with Jamaica. Serbia ranks 59th, along with Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Seychelles. Ukraine scores at 110th place above Russia. Russia is far below, still at 115th, just above Azerbaijan and Morocco, and above Turkey. Most people may not think that Russia is freer than Turkey, but Turkey is down at 119th. Thank you, Mr. Erdogan. And China at 129th, and Ukraine at 132nd. Personal freedom is marginally better in China than in Russia, in contrast to economic freedom. So that's the Human Freedom Index, as distinct from the Human Development Index. Now, a little word on the Democracy Index, which has been produced by the Economist Intelligence Unit, the EIU. It is equally telling. It rates 5 categories: electoral process and pluralism, the functioning of government, political participation, political culture, and civil liberties. This time it addresses the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and details the negative impact on democracy and freedom around the globe due to the withdrawal of civil liberties on a massive scale and the fueling of an existing trend of intolerance and censorship of dissenting opinion. Up to the pandemic, Norway, as in human development, ranked in the top 10. Ireland dropped to 8th place. Ireland had been on top for a number of years, however, in terms of the combined political culture and civil liberties. Germany at 14th, the UK 16th, the USA dropped to 25th place, continuing as one of the flawed democracies, along with, for example, Serbia, which has a very weak political culture, and an unfortunate number of other EU countries such as Belgium, France, and Portugal, all flawed democracies. Japan ranks 21st. In a lower category of hybrid regimes, Ukraine is at 79th, but Russia and China are in the bottom category of authoritarian regimes, with Russia at 124th place, and China fallen to 151st. Russia has a very low score for functioning of government and electoral pluralism, but China is much worse. There are other indices, such as the Press Freedom Index of Reporters Without Borders, the Freedom Index produced by Freedom House, and the Index of Economic Freedom produced by the Wall Street Journal and the Heritage Foundation. A composite index drawing on these three, and also the EIU's Democracy Index, identifies only 3 countries in the world that consistently enjoy the top combined ranking for general freedom, economic freedom, press freedom, and democracy. What are those 3 countries? You may be surprised. New Zealand, Switzerland, and Ireland. They are followed by Costa Rica, Denmark, Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and Sweden, who could all do better on the economic freedoms. The US and UK have declined and could do better on economic and press freedom, but China and Russia fare very badly as authoritarian regimes, with Russia only marginally better than China. The ratings, as with others, are comparative and dynamic. So this is where we are with, I would say, indices. Now, overall, there is some good globalization news. The indicator of global human development has increased 23.5% since 1990, from 0.597 to 0.737, as I mentioned earlier. This is an extraordinary achievement. But there are also profoundly positive outcomes from globalization economically and socially, but also negative consequences that have so far been exploited mainly by populism. I will talk a little bit about the negatives, the downsides. To a growing extent, existing political structures are increasingly proving inadequate to manage change, rapid accelerating change, before we even factor in the pandemic. Existing political structures at the global and national level have a deficit in leadership and seem adrift, devoid of new statecraft. Degraded rhetoric and growing demonization reflect a loss of ideals amplified by social media and fake news that have led to tangible and dangerous decline in the politics of compromise and cooperation upon which multilateralism is founded, not just nationally, but globally. Brexit, Trumpism, and the rising extremism of the far right were and are symptoms of this, but not root causes. This bodes ill for future social and political stability, and worse, makes increasing adversity inevitable and conflict almost unavoidable. The downstream effects of increasing inequality, resurgent nationalism, and disruptive populism represent a challenge to the architecture of post-Westphalian sovereignty and of the multilateral order since World War II. But this cannot be addressed without a better understanding of the causes of rising inequality and trends in global values on the one hand, and mutating identities, including of multinational conglomerates, on the other. Even before the pandemic, global income distribution continued to reflect massive distortions. Growth has been unbalanced everywhere. The richest 1% now own 44% of the world's wealth. And in the past pandemic year, they have gained more than $4 trillion in additional wealth. The richest 1%, richer by $4 trillion in 1 year alone. That is about the same amount as the value of labor income lost by workers laid off as a result of the pandemic, according to the IPS in Washington, the Institute for Policy Studies. Global labor income, before taking into account income support measures in 2020, is estimated by the International Labour Organization, the ILO, to have declined by 8.3%, which amounts to 3.7 trillion US dollars, close to the IPS estimate, or 4.4% of global GDP. The ILO notes that labor income, which is fundamental to the livelihoods of some 3.3 billion workers around the world, has been falling as a share of total national income to close to 50% compared to the income accruing to holders of capital. So the capitalists and their collective capital wealth is equivalent to the collective income of 3.3 billion people. That's a stark contrast. And that 3.3 billion's income has been a falling share of their total combined with capitalism. According to the ILO, labor markets around the world were disrupted in 2020 on a historically unprecedented scale. In total, there were unprecedented global unemployment losses in 2020 of 114 million jobs relative to 2019. But working hour losses in 2020 were approximately 4 times greater than during the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. And 8.8% of global working hours were lost relative to the fourth quarter of 2019. That's equivalent to a much larger figure of 255 million full-time jobs. The ILO would also tell you that about 1.5 billion people exist in precarious employment or the informal sector. Before the pandemic struck, a huge surge in growth was experienced by the poorest of the poor, up to 25% income growth for the poorest 10%, and even more for others in the bottom half, bulging up to 72% in the middle, a huge surge. However, by the mid-decade, by around 2015, 2016, the weakest increases were in the lower middle classes of the industrialized and developed countries, being merely 5 to 10%, while in Germany, the real income of the poorest 50% grew by 0 to 7%. And in the USA, by slightly over 20%, which was a bit better. In Japan, the poorest 10% saw their real income decline. So social inequality was already rising in tandem with increasing polarization and deterioration in the quality and courtesy of political discourse, even before the Trump presidency. There are other things happening, however, that provide ground for hope for further positive social change. Social media have begun to provide alternative space for diversity, but we will touch on other problems posed shortly, such as the fact that Twitter and Facebook, until too recently, amplified fake news more than truth. Meanwhile, the young generation have 2 well-founded fears, namely that their digital footprint will become a future liability for their careers, and that social media need to offer more diversity and not nurture the echo chamber or silo effect of reinforcing preferences until they become prejudices. Younger people need a right to be deleted and to have aspects forgotten, to have their profiles deleted, have their aspects forgotten. And they demand a right to the ownership over their preferences and their digital footprint so that they can better manage their digital identity and record. But they and all of us also need that social media offer an alternative algorithm, an icon for diversity that kicks in if they want to step outside the echo chamber and interact more effectively with the real world, and not just the circle of self-absorption of their existing avatars. Better managed, social media can become an instrument of personal and community self-empowerment if identity can be protected. And as much as people wish to evolve it, as with gender and cultural appropriation, and as many experiment with avatars and alter egos in cyberspace. Again, however, caution is advised, as Jadon Lanier, the American pioneer of virtual reality, has warned about the dangers of digital Maoism and online collectivism. Even more so with the pandemic, the digital divide has grown acutely between those who can study, earn, work, and trade online and those who cannot, sharply dividing not only the advanced countries from the less developed, but also within those advanced countries, those who are IT literate from those who are not. So this brings me to the topic of the Great Divergence, as Anne Kruger mentions it in her article on globalization. On a wider normative scale, let us talk about world values. On that normative scale, the World Values Survey reveals growing divides. Mass values are not converging with globalization. The Inglehart-Welzel World Cultural Map of that survey shows us how traditional values contrast with secular rational values, and survival values contrast with self-expression values. The survey shows that there is massive divergence in values between the advanced, knowledge-based liberal countries and the more traditional and insecure societies where basic needs remain a struggle in the third world. But recent years have also shown us that this divergence is mirrored inside the advanced societies themselves, as brought about sharply by recent studies of the sociology of Trumpism and the huge electoral divide in the US between the relative urbanism, liberalism, education, and prosperity, putatively of Democrats, and the more rural and traditional conservatism, putatively of Republicans, themselves sharply divided between plutocrats and what might be proactively called the stressed white proletariat. But see Ernesto Zedillo's article. Ernesto Zedillo, the former Mexican president who is the director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. He had an article in the journal Noema on rebuilding multilateralism after Trump. Norms of marriage, family, gender are moving in the same direction in advanced industrial societies, but not elsewhere. Countries that remain relatively economically stagnant show little value change. There is a growing divergence in values between high-income and low-income countries. Islamic societies strongly emphasize traditional values, but this changes only with greater education, peaceful outreach, and democratic reform. We'll see where MBS goes with this in Saudi Arabia. The largest increase in emancipative individual agency comes in the transition from industrial to knowledge societies, where existential security is strongest, secular norms and self-expression are stronger. Hence, perhaps a universal basic income may also help, and more countries are beginning to realize this, and the pandemic income supports introduced last year may point in this direction. However, it may become a placebo disguising underlying problems of demographic decline, job insecurity, and rising unemployment, and the changing nature of work in an era of increasing artificial intelligence and automation. Nonetheless, before the pandemic, demographic aging and particular talent shortages in several growth sectors were already prompting companies and countries to retain older workers and delay retirement and to increase female participation in the labor force. It's only 45%, for example, in Japan, and to tap the diaspora as China, India, Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, and Ireland have done quite effectively. It remains to be seen to what extent post-pandemic recovery will take fundamentally different directions in work practices, norms, and corporate office usage. But it can be expected that national greening policies on energy efficiency factors, as much as online productivity evolution, will make changes. To the extent that we can encourage emancipative values to grow stronger in countries that are undemocratic, such as North Korea, they can help trigger movements towards greater respect for human rights and hopefully democracy. They change the nature of desire, and democracy appeals due to its empowering qualities. Democracy has to be seen, therefore, as empowering, and controlled by elites or state capture as inherently disempowering. In the meantime, the increasing danger is that the role of the human individual is being called into question, not only by automation and artificial intelligence, dying ecosystems and resource depletion, but by the erosion of human rights, meaningful work, social cohesion, and the deconstruction of human personhood. Concerns about rising inequality have been raised by writers such as Thomas Piketty in his book on Capital. While some have debated the accuracy of his analysis, after all, isn't the world much more prosperous now than decades ago, and people on average much better off? The extent of massive and growing inequality in America and its plutocratic nature is brought out in OECD data. The extreme, if not obscene, growing wealth of the super rich, ultra high net worth individuals is also described as fostering morbid inequality. And the new rent-seeking mercantile ideology of disruption is actually a dangerous subversion of economic stability, taking shock therapy to a new level. On inequality, the Gini coefficient after taxes and transfers is 0.39 in the USA, higher than anywhere in Europe except Bulgaria, with the UK close behind, according to the OECD. As Simon Cooper has argued, poor Europeans fare better than their American equivalents and enjoy a life expectancy on average 81 years compared to 79 in the USA. And the media are far more trusted in Europe. There are less prominent filter bubbles. Some might argue with Cooper that American problems, from massive inequalities, fake news, media trust to political dystopia, are just that, American, and not per se Western, except that global opinion formers are clustered in the US. But if the West no longer exists, as Carl Bildt has said, and as Wolfgang Ischinger has pointed out in the Munich Security Forum, if the West no longer exists, then Europe needs its own public sphere, as Cooper argues, or the vision of a more integrated and self-reliant Europe that Merkel and Macron had dreamt of. However, the coming into office of President Biden may change all of this, hopefully, if he can tell us and show us that America is back. So, the decline of the middle classes in developed countries, combined with faltering reforms and reversals in ex-socialist states and the growing scale of precarious employment or outright redundancy, already lay at the heart of alienation from politics and institutions in those countries, especially amongst the young, who often account for much higher unemployment rates, even more so now due to COVID. The OECD has estimated that unemployment in the developed countries rose 6.8%. By January 2021. That's 1.6% more than a year prior, when the pandemic was just beginning to spread. In this regard, the decline in unionization and the erosion of collective bargaining had already significantly increased inequality and also contributed to the decline in working conditions, occupational safety, healthcare, and retirement benefits in the USA. The erosion of these benefits also spills over to affect non-union workers. The expected exponential impact of emerging artificial intelligence and accelerating automation, combined with algorithmically driven rapid capital movements, have also become major factors of uncertainty and social anxiety. As many as 40% of jobs could be automated with current technology by 2030, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers. Poorly managed migration and integration and the sense of cultural loss and eroding identity also undergird the resurgence of nativism, ultranationalism, and populism, and find acute expression in the Brexit dilemma. I would have a lot more to say, and I've written about the undemocratic challenges of what I call the concentration of apex power, the global commons, market concentration, media oligopolies, and multilateralism's renewal, the UN and related reforms of global governance. But I will stop here with the following closing remarks. Internal disparities are growing everywhere, but at the international level, multilateralism must deliver. If populism is in retreat following Biden's win of the US presidency, then this must not become an excuse for liberals and government to ignore the legitimate grievances that were exploited by populists. For much of the problems are real, even if their solutions were the wrong ones or suboptimal. Worse, they are now profoundly aggravated by the economic downturn of this pandemic and by looming climate change. Therefore, the downsides of globalization need redress, and urgently, if we are to keep free trade and relatively free movements of labor and capital. So on the one hand, pandemic notwithstanding, we have the greatest success in development progress and the governance of the global commons and the corpus of international law and regulations, without which we would have no international telecommunications, no Zoom, No air travel, no maritime predictability, nor peacekeeping. Our world would be racked by feudal wars and destruction like the Dark Ages in Europe. There is therefore a case for optimism. On the one hand, current pessimism could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, leading to fear and unilateralism. Yet if downside risks are better managed collectively and catastrophe can be avoided, historians in the future, I believe, may rightly regard our time as the best in history. Until the pandemic hit, more and more people everywhere were enjoying better lives than ever. They say that we have lost 30 years of this in 30 months of pandemic. Or I should say that should be 30 weeks. It's a quote from last year. Finally, therefore, we need to recover all of that and build forward better with compassion. The UN and the Bretton Woods institutions and other multilateral instruments can still get us there, as there is nothing better, but we must do it with more openness and greater civic participation everywhere through inclusive governance pathways. And the media have a huge role to play, but tackling market concentration, I would say, will be essential to fair play in that key sector as in others. But that's a topic for another day. And that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador O'Donnell. We really appreciate that. This is now the time for question and answer. But before we go into that directly, I wanted to share with you all, I'm not sure whether how closely you looked at the ambassador's bio, but being an ambassador and a member of the Sovereign Military or Sovereign Order of Malta, Military Order is still the formal name, is really quite a storied history. In fact, there's been recently published a book by Roger Colley entitled The Empires of the Sea, the Siege of Malta, and the Battle of Lepanto, and the Conquest of the Center of the World. It is a very richly researched book, and the story is told very well. So I encourage you to look at it. It's a display of very great courage. And before we came on formally, I was talking with the ambassador about that, just asking him how do they go about celebrating that, because the courage of so few men and women, a few thousand of them in the island of Malta, were able to hold back a Turkish force of about 30,000 or so trying to take it over, never did. And that's the great triumph, the great display of such great courage that the Knights of Malta did at that time. So it's a good book to pick up, and I would encourage you all to go ahead and do that. And I'm sure you will enjoy it when you do read it. But this is the kind of background, and this is the heritage that we have before us in Ambassador O'Donnell. So, Ambassador, the first question that I have here is not from me, it's from Bruce Frank. And he mentioned that that you presented a lot of different comparisons between countries. How were these comparisons made and who made them? He says his main reason for asking is because of the possibility of slanted results that could be depending upon the one's point of view, how these people. And I share in that myself. I was thinking about that, all those indices and all of that, and I'm wondering to myself, how did they come up with that? What are the views of those people? And if I knew the views, could I have basically anticipated those results? So that's the question, the first question.
Thank you. Well, I think I probably, when I was quoting these statistical comparisons, mentioned the sources, the nature of the index concerned, and where it was coming from. The Human Development Index was developed by the UN Development Programme, partly as a response to the excessive, I would say, dependence by global policymakers on the World Bank's perspective on gross domestic product as a fundamental benchmark of development. So what UNDP tried to do was to recenter policy, not so much on economic factors, but on human well-being, focusing on, for example, in the Human Development Report, focusing on life expectancy, on education, and on income. Those were the three original basic parameters which, from which evolved the Human Development Index, and it continues to evolve with additional factors that are brought into play. In all of these cases, whether it's the World Bank or the UNDP index, or whether it is Freedom House or with the Human Freedom Index, or the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, or any of the other ones that I mentioned, by and large, these depend on national statistics, which are produced by governments. So they take the actual statistics that governments produce, they run them through various statistical formulae to look at the averages and the outcomes, and then they look at the comparisons. Now, there are difficulties sometimes, and a lot of the critique about the Human Development Report, for example, has focused on methodological issues that have led to improvements and refinements over the years in two major cases. Where the World Values Survey is concerned, this is a little bit less, I would say, less rigorous, because it does depend somewhat on an understanding of liberal values versus traditional values, and on secular versus something else. And there is a lot of interpretation that goes into that, which is probably culturally influenced, if not directed. It's also the statistics that they come up with and the analysis that they come up with is, I would say, based on small scale samples rather than national statistics. But what I would like to say here is that these are most of these indices, to the extent that they are based on national statistics by governments. Now, sometimes you can question the validity of government statistics, certainly in countries which are not properly democratically accountable to people. But most of these are national statistics. And we are on the cusp of a different type of reality with the digital media companies, the digital giants, because they actually have command over an absolutely enormous volume of information, which is not being put into, I would say, public, transparent, beneficial use, but rather they are using this to fix prices on an individual basis. You want to book a plane or you want to buy a product and you want to do it online today, you will discover probably that the supplier whom you want to buy from is tailoring the price offer on the basis of your online activity rather than an objective market price that you would see if you went down to the marketplace or the store. So this type of thing is where I see a conundrum. I think that my own view would be that the digital giants should be regarded as public utilities to an extent, should come under some sort of public influence and accountability, and indeed should be able to provide much better real-time analysis of what's happening in terms of statistical trends in society globally. That would in fact be far more influential because of its scale and nature than what governments produce tediously on an annual basis in their national statistics. But this is a whole new discussion, and that's why when I talk about market concentration, which I only touched on, I actually believe, and I've been saying it for a few years in other conferences, that we need an international treaty that regulates global corporations. There is nothing of the sort at the moment. The worldwide companies that present themselves, whether it's the digital giants, Microsoft, Google, Apple, or whoever, or Guinness for that matter, all of these companies behave within some regard to local national laws and some international law, insofar as WTO, for example, has aspects that determine this. But their behavior on a host of issues, from human rights to environmental stewardship to gender equality, etc., this is guided by two things. One, the OECD Principles of Good Corporate Governance, which is a purely voluntary instrument. And the other one, the UN Global Compact that the late Kofi Annan brought about, which again is another purely voluntary instrument. Companies can sign on or not as they wish. There is no mandatory, legal, regulatory enforcement mechanism. Whereas if you want to fly an aircraft, I mean, in some sectors there is. If you want to fly an aircraft, you have to abide by IATA and ICAO regulations. If you want to use telecoms, you're fundamentally dependent on the International Telecommunications Union. Even in the medical sphere, WHO has a certain number of things to say in terms of, vaccines and medicines and so on. But for much of the rest of what happens in the world, including under the sea and in outer space, we don't have a properly regulating international thing, a treaty. And I would say we need to have it. We need to have it now to regulate things like drone warfare, automation, chemical and biological experimentation, a host of issues. So that's what I would say. It's a very good question, the comparison between countries. One has to look at it very carefully. And it's been going on for a long time. I've been describing the emergence of these indices over 30 years and how they have effect. But I think the big picture remains pretty much the same. Certain countries are like this, other countries are like that. Within the larger countries, the better developed countries, there are even sharp divisions. And these divisions are growing. And we need to try and bring the world back together again towards convergence and away from the great divergence that Anne Kruger points out.
Thank you. We have another person here that Ray Montango, he wanted to ask a question. Ray, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Actually, I was going to ask you initially about the power of these global companies, but you kind of addressed that already. But I did have another question then. Do you think the kind of the fragmentation we're seeing in countries, like Spain and Catalan and the Sudan and Timor and even Texas wants to secede from the United States and Brexit. Do you think that these are random events, or is this a kind of a global movement? You think that if some of these places are successful, we're going to see more of this?
Well, I don't think that the number of member states of the UN is fixed. I think it is very much subject to change. Some territories may combine, others may fragment. It's been happening all the time. I mean, apart from the breakup of the USSR, which I spoke a little bit about, we've also seen Czechoslovakia fragment, the former Yugoslavia break up in bits, and even one of its countries, Serbia, break up again with Kosovo. And we've seen Pakistan break into East Pakistan. I mean, we had East Pakistan and West Pakistan once. Now we just have Pakistan and East Pakistan as Bangladesh. We've had Ethiopia break up into Eritrea and Ethiopia. Somalia has broken up and not come back together in any kind of sense much lately. We've seen Sudan break into North and South, South Sudan being a separate country. And I think we will see a little bit more of that. I'm not saying it would be the case with Spain and Catalonia, but what might be even sooner might be Scotland and the next breakup of the UK, because the UK was already broken up 100 years ago when Ireland broke away, right? Because we used to be the United Kingdom. In fact, United Kingdom meant the United Kingdom of the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland. Well, we largely left. So what's left over is the rump UK of Great Britain and a little bit of Ireland called Northern Ireland, right? So that's the rump UK, and it might break up again if Scotland breaks away. And there is perhaps still a prospect of that. I'm not sure that you're necessarily following the political scandals between Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, and Alex Salmond, her predecessor, who then went and worked for the Russians for Russia Today with a talk show. But I mean, apart from that, they have elections in May. And those elections are more than likely going to have a significant impact on the prospect of independence of Scotland. I mean, Britain is suffering enormously from Brexit. I mean, it's in the first few months of this year alone, they have seen, since Brexit took effect, they have seen their trade with Europe drop by 40%. In other words, their trade with their largest trading partner has gone down 40%, 40%. This is only an early indicator of massive large-scale closures in Britain and unemployment. So who knows what will happen? Spain is a bit of a different situation. And I think the problem with Catalan independence is that it tips very slightly in favor, a little bit like the vote for Brexit, 51% or something like this. Countries need to have something where they have a supermajority requirement for major systemic changes, as Switzerland would have. A supermajority meaning maybe 2/3 must vote in favor. Otherwise, you know, the winds of fashion go back and forth very easily between marginal percentages, 50, 51, 49%. You know, Texas maybe gets 51% for independence tomorrow, but how much more difficult would it be if the requirement would be 2/3? I mean, it takes, you know, a lot more than that. In Ireland, in 1919, we had an election, and the vast majority of people wanted independence from the United Kingdom. If the UK had respected it, we would have had it without an independence war in 1920-21. And partition would never have taken place, because partition only existed to succor a loyalist minority in one tiny bit of Ireland. But it was important at that time, 100 years ago, because the shipyards of Harland and Wolff in Belfast were the shipyards that were building the naval power upon which the British Empire depended. And that is no longer the case today. So,
all right, thank you. We have another question, somebody who wants to ask a question, Clarice Collins. Clarice, go ahead and ask your question.
Actually, I kind of have two questions. One of them is, in the early part of George W. Bush's presidency, or in early 2001, so it's coming up on 20 years, one of our military planes crash landed in China. And, you know, the Chinese held on to it for a short period of time. And there was some question, are they going to give us our people back? And of course, we didn't want it to turn into a situation like the North Koreans taking a ship, the Pueblo, many years before, and held those people for years, actually. And you know, we kind of wondered in 2001, is China going to start World War III, or are they going to resolve this peacefully? And it seems like right after that, was that when China started, you know, they realized that they wanted our markets, they wanted our intellectual property, but they wanted our markets. And now, you know, for the last 20 years or so, China has risen. And I just wondered, do you consider that a turning point? We don't hear much about it anymore, but yeah, I just wondered your thoughts on that.
Was that the first question, or?
Oh, yes, that was the first question. You ready for the other question?
Well, let me take the first one since you paused.
Okay.
I'll take the first one. Yeah, I think that there is a threshold in international relations when countries realize that they have more to gain by pursuing multilateralism or bilateral cooperation than not. And I don't doubt the Chinese commitment to multilateralism and to upholding the current rules-based international order. However, they have the largest army in the world at about 2.1 million people, still smaller than the workforce for Walmart at 2.2 million. But their nuclear arsenal is relatively small, nothing on the size of Russia or the United States, by the way. And the US military, which is only around 1 million, but has 800 bases around the world, is financed in a vastly greater scale. In fact, US military expenditure is greater than the next 10 countries combined, which would include Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the benefits are clear from multilateralism, but this does not mean that China will not try to assert itself in those areas where it considers either it's of very, very strategic historic importance, or it's a low hanging fruit where they can make a quick gain and just get on with it. I would say the low hanging fruits are Hong Kong. So I mean, nobody's going to take a big issue with China over a change in the regime in Hong Kong, because it's not worth it, to be honest. Sadly, but true. Taiwan represents a slightly trickier one, but the South China Sea and the Himalayas are much more dangerous, because in the Himalayas they're up against India, and in the South China Sea there are too many other countries which are in contest with China on its claims of the Paracel and Spratly Islands, and China has not accepted the ruling of the United Nations on that particular issue, and it should be obliged to do so. Now, we are faced with a situation today where only in the past few days, not just the UK and the EU, but also Canada and the United States have pitched in with sanctions against some Chinese because of the repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Now, I would say that I understand the background to this thing, as has been explained to me by people in China, and how China is simply trying to deal with what had been a terrible upsurge in Islamic terrorism at a certain point in time. This I understand. But apart from that, it would seem to me that if China can, even reluctantly after a year, accept the World Health Organization comes in to investigate the origins of COVID in a wet market in China, that it can also accept an international mission by the UN Human Rights Office, the International Labour Organization, which knows a lot about vocational training camps, and the International Organization for Migration, that an interagency mission from the UN could go in, maybe with the Red Cross, I don't know, and look at the situation in these camps and advise the Chinese government on how they could better align the management and purposes of these camps with international obligations. This should be relatively easy to do, but it might take China a year of these sanctions to realize this, but I think it's probably the way to go. And during that year, they should clean up their act so that when the mission comes, it looks pretty much like it's not so genocidal or toxic as it is alleged to be. But, you know, I mean, that's what I would say on that one, just sort of thinking aloud.
Clarice, I know you had a second question, but could we, is it possible to just go maybe with one question with some of the others, and then we can come back to you if we have some time at the end? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Ambassador O'Donnell, we have here another one called from, I think, from Jack, and he's asking, please discuss the impact of immigration policy on globalization. And that's a very tricky question. I think for the United States, but not only for the United States. I know I've attended lectures with you all in Europe having to deal with immigration and the impact of immigration there. And how is that? What is the impact of that on globalization?
Well, I think from a historic point of view, migration, the movement of people from country to country or different regions of the globe, lies perhaps at the origin of globalization to begin with. The creation of countries like Australia, New Zealand, and the United States itself, let alone Canada and indeed Israel. So migration is there. The funny thing is that there are a lot of colonial attitudes still attached to it. So that when we talk about British people living in Spain in their retirement or just for whatever reason, we talk about expatriate workers or retirees. But they're migrants, just like the people who are trying to get into the United Kingdom to get a job and a better livelihood. So there are still a lot of these prejudices involved in the discussion, but many countries depend on migration. Britain itself and other countries, Ireland, depends on migration, sometimes seasonal migration for crop harvesting. I mean, the south of Italy is heavily dependent on migration for a lot of its agricultural produce.
Mm-hmm.
Ireland is dependent on immigration for its meat processing plants, for example. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with migration, but it does need, of course, to be regulated. And the problem we have today is that a lot of it is happening on an illegal basis. But what I would say here is that illegal migration and illegal facilitation of refugee and asylum seekers is a major international criminal organized business. There is huge interests of a criminal nature involved, quite often in tandem with or in partnership with local police forces and border officials in the receiving countries or the transiting countries. I mean, this is definitely the case where Turkey is concerned. But at the same time, Turkey has hosted about 3 million Syrian refugees, which, you know, is phenomenally more than the numbers that have been accepted into Germany or any other EU country for that matter. So it's a big challenge. It's highly political. And I think that the only way that these things can be properly addressed is through a common respect for human rights, for the various conventions of the International Organization for Migration and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and for countries to engage in burden sharing where possible, so that it doesn't, migration from Africa doesn't fall too heavily on Malta, which is, but is shared with other members of the European Union. But it's a long, it's the subject of a PhD thesis for Jack if he wants.
Thank you very much. I still was wondering a little bit about migration, whether you are making a distinction there, because you seem to think of it very heavily as criminal. And when I think about migration as criminal, I'm thinking mostly of human trafficking, which is considerable and a real problem, but is different than other forms of migration. Do you not think so?
No, I agree with you. I agree. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. The other question we have here is, how is freedom measured? This is from Bruce Frank, and that too is a significant question. Sometimes the people in Asia struggle with Western understanding of freedom. Does freedom mean no meaningful responsibility? Is freedom always only individual? Does it necessarily have to fragmentize the society, or can it still be really within the context of very heavy laws and respect for traditions and whatnot? So, for instance, the people in Singapore would argue considerably and vociferously with men and women in the West as to what freedom really is. So this is a very good question. How is freedom measured?
Well, it is a good question, and I would say we look at freedom perhaps as a human right. First of all, would bring us to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and indeed to the UN Charter in 1945. Now, if we take a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt had such an important role to play in crafting, we see it as at a UN level as something which is universal. But the perspective on this differs from culture to culture. In the Western world, where, and I would speak in particular of, say, the Western European and American Canadian worldview, this notion of human rights derives from the American and the French revolutions, for example, and from a certain concept of the Enlightenment.
Yes.
Right. Whereas, and of individual liberty as the individual human being being the object or subject of freedom. Whereas in the Eastern cultures, especially places like China and Japan, maybe, and Korea, the perspective on this is not so individualistic and much more collective. And that is why in the 80s, there was this movement towards demands for a new international economic order, based partly on a Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, as distinct from the rights and duties of individuals. So, and we had the emergence of the G77, or the non-aligned movement, which tried to straddle the polarities between the West and the communist bloc, the socialists, and the Soviet Union in particular, because the non-alignment movement was also led by communist Yugoslavia at the time, by Tito. So, so these things differ, I think, a lot, the understanding of freedom. But to the extent that we are in a global society today, a planetary society of sorts, we need to have fairly common understandings about core concepts that determine how we govern ourselves and how we relate to each other. And that's why I think a dialogue, a sort of an alliance between civilizations, but certainly a dialogue between them, is extremely important. And that's why the cultural aspect of international relations, and indeed of multilateralism itself, are extremely important. We don't often pay enough attention to cultural diplomacy as an instrument of dialogue and common understanding.
All right. Well, I want to say that we are just about at 8:30, and I think the questions that we have remaining, we'll go through them, but this is where we are right now. And so maybe no more questions, at least after these few questions, and then we'll close after that. So, but somebody here, I think it's Betty. Betty is saying that she have a question. So Betty, what is your question?
Yes. Frank, if you could just briefly comment on market concentration. If we're talking about capitalism, then one has to equate that with the free enterprise system. With the free enterprise system, one has the hazards of buying and selling and buying out and what have you. And you and I have had this discussion, and I agree that market concentration for me as a consumer does not increase the competition of what I can choose. It decreases it. And if you try to regulate that and rope it, aren't you sort of flying in the face of capitalism, free enterprise? And how would you suggest, just briefly, corralling this so I have more choices of gas stations, of banks, and just things in general in the market?
Yeah, well, as I probably mentioned when we talked in Ireland, during the late days of the Obama government, his Council of Economic Advisors produced several reports which were particularly interesting. One was on artificial intelligence, another was on automation in December 2016. But a report in April of 2016 was on the benefits of competition. And that particular report is a real eye-opener. Unfortunately, in the remainder of his tenure, he didn't really address the things that were revealed in that report, and hopefully, and Trump certainly didn't, but hopefully Biden may get around to doing so. But it showed, this report showed that using standard metrics, there have been enormous increases in market concentration. Now, what is market concentration? It's when the big fish eat the small fish, and through mergers and acquisitions, you basically have the marketplace of a particular nature dominated by just a few players. So in the agricultural area, it could be Monsanto. In pharmaceuticals, it would be one or two other companies. In the media area, it would be 5 or 6 big conglomerates dominating the entire American media market. And what the report brought out was that it was not just true of internet giants and social media, and we know Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so on, but in varying and increasing degrees in mainstream media, telecommunications, in energy, pharmaceuticals, as I mentioned, healthcare, retail, trade, distribution and transport, banking, finance and insurance, agro-industry, I mentioned, real estate and leasing, utilities, tourism, and even consultancy services. And what happens is the dominant firms engage in predatory behavior, increasing rents and reducing sectoral firm entry and labor market mobility. They are also engaged in a whole lot of other types of things, like they benefit from network effects and unfair competition with newcomers and smaller players. The other thing is that these large giants are much more inclined to go towards automation, whereas small enterprises, the smaller the business, the less likely it is necessarily going to go, as a generality, towards automation and more likely to hire people. So and also in economic recovery circumstances, we know from experience that the bulk of economic recovery is usually undertaken by the stimulus of small enterprises, SMEs. And to the extent we want to recover from COVID, we have to really give a helping hand to small businesses so that they can start up and sort of generate the employment that is so important to that kind of recovery. And in the final analysis, remember that a worker actually pays taxes. A robot does not. So if the world economy is run by robots and AI, who's going to be paying the taxes that's going to fuel government expenditures kind at all? You know, so.
All right.
That's
thank you. I think that's almost basically we are over our time now at 8:35. But being the
Clarice had a second question, no, Clarice?
Clarice, you can go ahead, Clarice, with your second question.
I recall that in 1998 there was a hurricane that just about destroyed Honduras and Nicaragua. Hurricane Mitch, I think was its name, in October of '98. And at that point, the World Bank, these countries had loans there, and the World Bank forgave all their loans, which I think is wonderful. But it got me thinking, who backs up the World Bank? Is it like other banks? Are there investors that are, trying to make some money off of it? The World Bank and the IMF, who backs that up?
Well, member state governments are the ones who finance the World Bank, basically, which has different lending windows. One of it through the IDA, or the International Development Association of the World Bank, is the soft loan window, which countries can borrow from. But the IMF is also, you mentioned, is extremely important. And one of the things that I and certain other people, including a number of leaders in the World Leadership Alliance of the Club de Madrid, had been sort of trying to advocate for the IMF to have a much more liberal approach to the poorer countries, especially in the context of their necessary efforts to deal with the pandemic and to recover eventually from it. Unfortunately, the administration of Donald Trump was dead set against a new release of what are called special drawing rights by the IMF, but the Biden administration has proven to be more in favor. And so I think the IMF will now be better positioned to have those SDRs, or special drawing rights, made available to these poor countries so that they can actually finance their recovery.
Thank you. Oh, I since I'm the moderator here, at least for the Q&A, I have the privilege of one last question, very quick one. It is traditional. I heard what you said about traditional values and secular values, et cetera, and I'm wondering, just to be clear, is how would you assess the values of traditional values? Is traditional values good or bad or inferior?
That's a loaded question. Well, it wouldn't really be a matter of, I mean, I'm quite conservative in many ways. So a lot of my values would probably be fairly traditional. But from the point of view of the sociological analysis that goes into the interplay between traditional values and economic performance and liberal political environments, values that are seen to be traditional, that would, for example, restrict the role of women in society and work against gender equality, would not be, the best ones to have in the 21st century. Okay. So I think, it really depends on what we're talking about. The value of religious freedom and the ability to go to church, and for, there is, I would say, there has been in the secularization of Western societies in the past few decades, there has been a bit of an artificial struggle between secularism and religion, whereby, because religious freedom is a fundamental human right, and that human right is a right which is a right to its public expression as well as its private observance. So, but there are a lot of people who are intolerant of the public expression of religion. So they want to have Muslim women not covered face up. They want to have nurses and doctors not wearing crucifixes. They want to remove the crucifix from the school walls and other places in public buildings. They want no reference to the Bible, and they certainly don't want any celebration of Christmas in a public place. There has been a tendency to go overboard with the distinction between church and state, because that distinction can indeed exist, but it does not mean that religion must be a purely private affair and that it can have no place in the public sphere. So I think these are some of the issues that people probably try to address. Now, not that issue, in fact, that I've just described is not necessarily addressed in the World Values Survey, except in a very cursory sort of dismissive way. But it is something which is very felt deeply in Europe, where a lot of people want to have the freedom to express their religion in public without prejudice to the same freedom being enjoyed by others, including the freedom of non-believers. So it's important that we kind of keep a kind of an inclusive and global perspective on this.
Thank you, Ambassador O'Donnell. Betty, I think I'm handing this back to you now.
Oh, Donald, you did a wonderful job moderating. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And thank you for those who stayed with us. You had really quite a large audience, Frank, this evening, which we're very pleased. I think one of our larger audiences, which of our series, I think that says that people were very interested in this topic, globalization. I want to thank you especially for staying up. I want to thank your alarm clock for working. You had to set it to go off. And I want to say that we're not meeting next week. Speaking of religious holidays in the Christian world, it is Holy Week, that perhaps it's also spring break. So that's probably the more practical reason. but it's going to be a busy week. People are either not going to be here or they're going to be attending to various factors, getting ready for Easter, I suppose, and be off. We are going to be returning on April the 6th for the Korean Peninsula. We're going to have Dr. Sangwon Lee, who is going to be coming from us from Ball State University, be talking about the Korean Peninsula, speaking of the Asia Pacific. And then we meet last this year on April the 20th with Brexit and the European Union. And after this evening's discussion, you probably want to come back and take that in. We have Dr. John McCormick, who's been highly recommended to us. He is from England, so he's going to have that good perspective of Brexit. I want to say on that evening, we're going to end our program year with another nightcap. For those of us who joined us last week for our nightcap, it was a great deal of fun. Frank, this is something where we used to meet live and people would gather and so forth. And so we tried to add a little bit of informality to it. A couple of our programs where we sort of do a hard stop at 8:30, we say, go to your lager and grab your favorite beverage, whatever it might be, and come back and join us for a very informal. It was really great fun. I think it made people feel kind of good. So once again, thank you all for coming this evening. It was very interesting, provoked a lot more questions. I wish this wasn't something where we were meeting informally because it could go off into a lot of other directions. And I want to say good night. Frank, hold on for just another minute before you sign off. And but thank you all for coming.